Hi, everyone. I am so excited for you to have the chance to listen in on a conversation I had with my guest, Guy Stevens, as we talk about a topic that sadly I know many of you can relate to. Guy is a nationally recognized expert on restraint and seclusion and the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, which is a national nonprofit working to transform school discipline and create safer, more equitable schools for all students and staff. His advocacy is deeply informed by his experience as a parent, advocating for appropriate supports for his neurodivergent son, and his belief that embracing neurodiversity and neuroscience is essential to creating safe, inclusive environments for all. Today's episode is part one in a two-part series because we just had so much to cover. I just couldn't limit it to one episode. So with that, please enjoy part one of my conversation with Guy Stevens. Hello, Guy. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really excited for our listeners to get to know you and the work that you do.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
I let folks know that this is going to be a two-part series. And the reason for that is because when our friend Kelly, who I'm very grateful for her putting us in contact, when she connected us and I had the chance to talk with you, I thought, oh, there's way too much here for one episode. My listeners
I thought you
know.
just realized I talk way too much. So
That's not a bad thing when you have good things to say. My
sure.
listeners know I try to keep these episodes short for them. So what I would love to begin with, because I think it's essential for every guest that I have on, but especially your story, is to hear more about how you came to be doing this work with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. And then we're going to talk about exactly what that work is. But beginning with, how did you find yourself here doing this very important work?
Sure. And that's a great question. So I started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint in the spring of 2019. And it was a pretty unexpected road that brought me there. I was not back in 2019 in a place where I was thinking, gee, I want to do something else with my life. Why don't I start a nonprofit? But life came, kind of came with some things that happened. And that lived experience led me to leave a job I had been in for well over 2 decades to start a small nonprofit really focused on not just restraint and seclusion, but a lot of the things that are done to kids, often in the name of behavior. And the way that I ended up here was that, like probably many, as a parent of, I have 2 children, both neurodivergent. My son, unfortunately, experienced being physically restrained and secluded at a school in Maryland. Restraint and seclusion were not things that would even have been on my radar of possibilities of things that might have been done to him at school.
Yeah.
I would not have imagined there might be a scenario where my son was physically held or held down in some way and prevented from moving freely. I would not have imagined a scenario where my son might have ended up being forcefully put into a room while somebody pushed the door shut and held it shut. Those were not things that I would have imagined, but we had a situation where these things happened to my son, and they happened to him on a couple of timelines. The very first time it ever happened to him, he was only about 6 years old. He was in the first grade. He was out on a playground. He didn't want to come in. Eventually, he was physically restrained, carried in, and put into an empty office. At that point, we got a phone call saying that there was a situation, and it was explained to us. Again, restraint and seclusion were not terms that were used. And nor would I have imagined that those were practices that would be repeatedly used in a school. And for many years, in fact, after that instance, things went well. He moved actually at the end of that year into a smaller classroom setting. And while today that might not have been my choice at the time, it seemed like a good option. And he was actually pretty successful. He had a good team, very relationally based, and he made a lot of progress over a number of years. Unfortunately, at the end of 5th grade, we again experienced him being restrained and secluded, and that ultimately led to a situation where he was afraid to go back to school.
Yeah.
And we were afraid to send him back, and ultimately we ended up homeschooling him for 2 years before he made a decision that he wanted to go back to school. And while we were supportive of the decision, we were also concerned. We
Yeah.
were concerned based on what had happened before. And, I had always taken my role really seriously, kind of as a father and an advocate for my child. I had taken my part in kind of IEP team meetings very seriously. I went in with ideas and suggestions and recommendations. I was a very active part of our team. And in the time since he had been out of school to the time he was returning, I'd even done more. I'd taken a program with our state, kind of the, there's a network of education centers around the country, kind of parent centers, parent training centers. I'd taken some training with our parent training center around advocacy, around, IEPs, around IDEA, kind of the federal law around special education. So, as he went prepared to go back, we advocated to make sure that what had happened before did not happen again. And
how old was he
unfortunately,
at that point when he
well,
decided
at
he
that
wanted to go
point,
back?
he would have been 13 years old.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he was returning to school. He was going into the eighth grade.
Yeah, middle school.
We kind of reached an IEP, and he started that new placement in the fall of 2018. He was excited. We were excited, but also a little bit cautious.
Yep.
But we had done, I think we had done our due diligence. We had worked with the school and provided a lot of information on how to support him. He should never have had those things happen to him previously. But they did, and they had an impact. And ultimately, he started that placement in the fall of 2018. He was there for about 15 days. And in the first 15 days he was there, he was repeatedly restrained and secluded.
Oh my God.
In fact, probably about 5 times over those 15 days. And the last instance of this happening, a large man dragged him to a room. Dragged him across the floor and to put him into a seclusion room.
Wow.
And that was so impactful on him that he did not want to return to school. We did not feel safe sending him back to school.
Yes.
And ultimately, it was that experience that led to a conversation with my son. And the conversation was something along the lines of, this is not okay. If you looked at what the state law said in Maryland, which is where I live, at the time this was done to my son, and I'll just point out, there's no federal law that governs the use of physical restraint and seclusion in schools around the nation. Okay. So every state is kind of on their own in terms of what their laws say or don't say. Maryland actually happens to have some of the better laws in the country around this. But if you looked at what the law said at the times my son had been restrained and secluded, all the way up from the first grade until the present time that it was happening, he should never have been restrained and secluded. His behavior did not meet the legal threshold for when physical restraint and seclusion would have been appropriate.
Yes.
So I had a conversation with my son and I said, this is not okay. At this point, he was out of school. We were advocating to get him a home and hospital or homebound placement in the short term. And I said, this is not okay. What was done to you was not okay. And I made him a very simple promise. And the promise was, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure this doesn't happen to you again or other kids like you.
Yeah.
At that moment in time, I don't think I reflected on what that would mean. I had no intent of, I'd been in my job for well over 20 years. I worked in the environmental field. I had no intent of leaving that job and starting a nonprofit. But that moment and that promise set me down a path of doing a lot of research, trying to figure out why these things were happening, who they were happening to, and what we could do differently. And ultimately, that's what led me to start the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I know my listeners well, and I know that there are people who will relate to your entire story as a whole. And if not the entire story, then absolutely pieces of it. I shared with you that I had the same experience as a parent with my daughter when she was very, very young. I would say much less severe of an experience than what your son went through. And yet she still talks about it.
Right.
It's that it doesn't have to be that as severe or traumatic as I'm sure it was for your son, for it to really stay with these kids.
Yeah. Well, and it does. It stays. These kind of experiences are traumatic, and they can stay with you for a lifetime. I know kids that, when they were 7 or 8 years old, were forced in seclusion rooms or restrained, who at 20 some years old still are afraid to step in an elevator or sleep with their door shut at night.
Yes.
The impact can be really lifelong, and tragically, the impact of the use of restraint and seclusion not only is it that trauma, but kids have died. I mean, hundreds of kids
Wow.
have died being physically restrained and secluded in schools around the nation. Around the same time this happened to my son in the fall of 2018, across the country over on the West Coast, a young man named Max Benson, who was 13 years old, like my son, autistic like my son, liked
Mhm.
collecting things, liked they being outdoors, loved animals like my son.
Mhm.
He was in a specialized school in California. He became dysregulated. He kicked a wall. He became upset. He was put into a prone restraint. That prone restraint led to his death. And it's tragic. I mean, I've actually met members of his family. I met his grandfather at one point. We
Wow.
have a volunteer who was a neighbor of the family. Um, it's really tragic, and unfortunately, that's not an isolated case. There was a report back in 2009 by the Government Accountability Office, and they found hundreds of instances of death and abuse in public and private schools and treatment centers due to the use of things like restrained seclusion. But it's even more broad than that because it's not just about restrained seclusion. And that's what I found very early on with this.
Yeah.
It's, in a school setting, yes, restrained seclusion are part of it, but it's also suspension, expulsion,
Yes.
corporal punishment. It's a
Yes.
lot of punitive and exclusionary discipline. And that has a real negative impact on children and families.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, yep, been there too. My
Yeah.
husband and I, we joke now, but it wasn't funny at the time about being invited to find a new preschool for my daughter when she was very,
Mm.
very young.
Yeah.
And again, just as parents, how devastating that is when you know your child is good and tenderhearted and wants to do well, and you
Right.
as parents are doing everything you can think of, right, to have
Yeah.
that happen. I don't know. I'm just going to put this out there, and then you can respond to it in whatever way makes sense. But I meet a lot of professionals who change the course of their life work based on their personal experiences. It's exactly what happened to me as well. I don't meet many dads,
Right.
to be
Right.
honest
Right.
with you, right? It's
Yeah.
a in our kind of niche of the people that we serve and the families we
Sure.
support, there's a lot of moms who make that transition. And I don't know if it, I mean, I just wanted to highlight that. And I think it's
Sure.
such a
Sure.
unique experience for us to hear from a dad who's done this
Yeah,
work.
and it shouldn't be, and I'd like to see that change, to be honest with you. But it is. When I first began on this journey, um, I knew a lot of other children, from my son, and when it came to things like IEP team meetings, dads weren't there. When it came to even medical visits and understanding diagnoses, dads weren't there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that we still see widely as a culture that sometimes things like school and medical kind of appointments and things like that often end up on mom's plate, and dad may be updated but not involved. I think that's doing a disservice to children. I think having more dads involved where possible can be really beneficial, and obviously not every situation allows for that. But I'm a little disappointed that more dads aren't involved in this kind of work. And like you, I mean, I've worked with a lot of people that have been on similar journeys. I think about that first one of those first parenting courses that I did. It was a program with a Parents Place of Maryland, 60-hour program.
Mm.
I think that there were initially two fathers in a class of probably 40. I might have been the only one that completed that. I don't recall if the other one completed that or not. But we don't see a lot of fathers involved, and it's important. I mean, there's nothing more important. I mean, I don't have to tell you this. There's nothing more
Yeah.
important than your children.
Yeah.
If nothing else matters in my life, my kids, matter immensely to me. And I know there's a lot of dads out there that feel the same way, but don't realize
Yes.
how important their contributions and presence can be.
Or
So
don't know what to do, right? So that's
sure,
the other
sure,
piece that I
yeah,
see a lot with the dads that I work with a lot of dads,
right,
and they are motivated. They
right,
just don't know where their place is or how to step
right,
into this, and
sure, sure.
it
Well,
feels awkward and disorienting.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah.
and it's a journey, right? It's a journey, and it begins with something simple. Sometimes, I remember that one of the first books that I read as I was really kind of embarking on this journey was one of the books from Pete Wright, from Emotions to Advocacy,
Hmm.
really kind of talking about how you go from feeling all these things that you feel, going through this process of special education,
Yes.
to how do you become an effective advocate? How do you understand
Mm.
these things? And quite frankly, I mean, it's a lot. When my son first began really having difficulty, I dumped my free time went into understanding what IDEA was, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act,
Yeah.
understanding what an IEP was. That wasn't just something that I was doing for pleasure necessarily, but I realized it was really important. So,
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
for, dads that may not know where to start, starting somewhere. I mean, starting somewhere, and even just, being, where you're able to be a united team in cases and work
Yes.
together and collaborate, where that's a possibility. I think it's really meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move into what you do specifically at the Alliance, I would love to hear a little bit about where your son is today. I could do the math and figure out his age,
Sure,
but if
sure,
you could
sure,
make
sure.
it easy on us and just
Sure,
tell us what
sure,
his
sure.
age now is
Yeah,
and
yeah,
how he's doing and kind of what it's looked like since that
sure,
last exit from
sure,
schooling.
sure. So, he, as I mentioned, he was 13 years old when this last was done to him, and in the when that happened, and I had that conversation with him. In the short term, we advocated for a home and hospital or homebound placement, and that placement actually became his placement for the remainder of the school year, which was most of the school year. Home and hospital or homebound is not typically designed to be a placement over a long period of time.
Yeah,
But the problem was we weren't sure what else to do.
yeah,
And when he got a homebound or home and hospital teacher, we got very lucky because he got a teacher who had been teaching for about 50 years across many different settings. And you can do that math, and you'll find that this teacher was in his 70s.
right, right.
His name was Steve. Steve came over to our house the first couple of times with no mission other than to get to know my son. And he wanted to get to know us a little bit as well. And he built a relationship with my son. He worked with my son throughout that school year. Ultimately, Steve is actually somebody, in fact, he just had a birthday recently, and Steve is somebody still in our lives. My son,
Mm.
after working with Steve for that year, he became friends. He would go over to Steve's house and help him out with yard work and other things. But this short term, we were not sure what to do. We didn't feel confident that we could send him back to the school that he was in and that he would
Yeah.
be appropriately supported. So we ultimately pushed for a non-public or private placement at the expense of the district. So under IDA, of course, there's a continuum of placement options that should be available. And of course, districts don't necessarily want to send people out of district
Yes.
because that can be done at a greater cost. And very often, parents might even have to push for that. Now, some parents are forced into out of district placements that they don't want.
Mm.
In our case, we advocated for it. The hard part was finding one that would be appropriate. And we actually found a fantastic non-public placement that was trauma informed, that was aligned with the ideas that we thought were really important. It was very non-traditional. And he ended up doing all 4 years of high school in this non-public placement,
Okay.
where they began with the priority of focusing on relationship and
Yes.
connection
Yes.
and building trust.
Yes.
That was essential. And I told them from the beginning, it's like, I care less about the academics right now than I do about establishing this as something that he feels safe and secure and seen and valued.
Yes.
And that's the work they did. And it was hard work, but he ended up all 4 years of high school there. Did he get all of the opportunities he should have gotten in a high school experience? No, he didn't.
Yeah.
But he got something really important. He got that connection and support, and he graduated from that program and then went into a college. He went into a program in Western Maryland. I live in Maryland, and it's a couple hours away from here. It was a community college program in forestry. He loved being outdoors. He loved nature. And he got into this program, and I'll never forget the first week, he had some doubts. He was felt a little overwhelmed. And I remember having a conversation with him about, maybe this was a mistake. He did absolutely amazing things in his schooling there. He graduated within 2 years in that program, got a degree in forestry and forest management, and he's now working on a more advanced degree, hoping to get a bachelor's degree. He's 20 years old, and he's doing really well.
Okay.
And I think I shared that with you when we talked. That I'm really proud of him. But the thing I know from doing this work is that a lot of kids that end up in the situation that my son ended up in, their outcomes aren't always good, because a lot of kids that are on the other side of a lot of punitive and exclusionary discipline or restraint seclusion, these are kids that don't feel safe, don't feel welcome at school. We can't learn when we don't feel safe. Of course, we can't We can't, you can't educate if we're not, making sure that kids are regulated. And a lot of kids, they disengage. They don't feel seen or heard or valued. They show school refusal. Sometimes if they're young, they might, as they get older, stop attending. We have a lot of kids that end up going down this pathway that end up moving down the school to prison pipeline. So while I'm so, happy about my son and how he's doing,
Yeah.
I know a lot of kids that we're working with that are going through these situations. Their outcomes aren't so good. So I
Right.
think that's what makes
Right.
this work so important.
So important too, because what I also hear you talking about is the way that families are resourced differently. And even,
Absolutely.
we're talking about two-parent households a minute ago, which is not the case for every family.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And just the other internal and external resources that really have to be in place for parents to have the endurance
Right.
that's required here. And with what you have started with your nonprofit, it's such a great external resource for any family, but especially
Sure.
those families who really don't have that. I'm so glad that you shared the whole story. Thank you for doing that because I think it's rare for parents to hear about those outcomes that you described
Right.
with your son.
Right.
And I know they're possible. I talk to parents
Right.
where that's the
Right.
case, but it's just such a hopeful story. But I know that it didn't come without a ton of heartbreak and stress and work on
Yeah,
his
no,
part
no, it's
and your
not
part.
easy. And sometimes the systems are aligned against us. I mean, I hate to say that, but there are a lot of people that have the best intentions for supporting us and our children, but systems sometimes are not working the way that they should. And, parents are led to believe things that aren't true. Parents are gaslit. The process can be really hard.
Yes.
You mentioned, resources is critical. We homeschooled my son for 2 years after he was afraid to go back. We were really fortunate to be in a position we could do that, but not every
Yeah.
parent can do
That's
that.
right.
And if you're a
That's right.
parent and you're sending your child to a place where you don't believe that they're safe or seen or being supported appropriately, there is nothing harder than being a parent in that kind of position
Yes.
and not knowing what else to do.
That's right. Yeah, the pit in your stomach when you drop them
Yeah.
off and leave them there. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or every time the phone rings, the jump that you have
Yes.
because you're waiting to hear what's going on
Yes.
or what might be happening that day.
Yep. Yeah, I know. The parents listening will relate to that for sure.
Yeah.
I do want to switch gears just a little bit so that we can hear about the mission and the vision of the Alliance,
Sure.
the advocacy work you do, any other work you do. For those listening, part two is going to really focus in on concrete steps that parents can take and also that educators and administrators that I know are listening, what they can take as well. But let's start with that. Let's start with the bigger picture
Sure.
and the
Sure.
mission and the
Sure.
vision. That would be great.
So again, when I started the Alliance, I don't know that I would have imagined that, several years later, I'd be having this conversation with you. When I started the Alliance, I've been doing a lot of research. I've been finding a lot of things, connecting with a lot of people. Ultimately, I started the Alliance initially really as a means of sharing some of the information I was finding. I knew there were other people out there like our family that had been through something like this. And my thought was, well, maybe if I share what I found, it might be helpful to somebody else. I was pretty early in the journey, but we were already beginning to influence a change within our school district. We got the attention of the district. We were working towards changing the policy, changing the practice, bringing in different training. And I thought, well, gee, I'm just the dad, and if I can do that, then other people can do things too.
Yeah.
So the very first mission of the Alliance, I would say, was about having people know they weren't alone. And I also wanted them to know they could influence change because, I was seeing that. I was seeing there was some potential there to bring about changes. But the Alliance, after I started, it began to grow. And I don't know that I ever expected that. I didn't expect to start a nonprofit, then eventually get to a point where I'm like, well, gee, I'm going to leave my job and just focus on this. That was not at all my intent. But it started to happen. We started to get more and more people connecting with us, and they were parents, they were self-advocates, they were, other caregivers, they were teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, a
Mhm.
lot of therapists, occupational therapists, counselors. And what was in common with the people that were connecting with us was that they shared our belief that we could do something better, right? That we
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
do something better than restraining and secluding, that we could do something better than suspending, expelling, subjecting kids to corporal punishment. And the mission began to grow. Today, and it grew to the point where, again, when I started this, I had a full-time job. I worked in the environmental field. I worked for a university. I wasn't planning to leave that job. I had no intent of leaving
Yeah.
that job. I would have imagined that I would have stayed there until I retired. I mean,
Right.
that's kind of where I was in my career. But eventually I got to the point where I realized that what I had started with the Alliance had grown to such a size and responsibility that I had two full-time jobs.
Yeah.
And I quickly began to realize that was not sustainable. And at some point kind of was like, well, gee, I've got to make a choice here. I can't do both of these things.
Yeah.
And I suppose a more reasonable version of myself would have said, well, Guy, your job at the university pays your mortgage. You should probably focus on that. But I was so strongly moved by what I was finding and felt
Yeah.
like somebody had to do something here. So I made a decision to leave that job, and I gave him a 6-month leave of notice that I was going to leave. I wasn't really sure how I was going to be able to, at least kind of bring in an income through the work and support my family.
Yeah.
But I thought I somehow would figure out a way. And if you knew me, you'd know that I'm not somebody who takes these big kind of risks, but I was really compelled by it and felt like I had to do something.
Yeah.
So the Alliance today, now it's what I do full time. I have another staff member as well. We have about 50 volunteers from across the country and even into Canada and elsewhere. What we do today is really focus on 3 areas. We focus on legislation, law, policy. We focus on education, and we focus on support.
Okay.
What that looks like from a legislative point of view, we've worked with school districts, we've worked with schools, we've worked with state lawmakers, we've worked with federal lawmakers to influence changes in laws and policies. So, for example, there was a district I worked with at one point in Vermont, and we worked with them to change their policy around restraint and seclusion. They all eventually changed their policy to a point where they prohibited seclusion and prone restraint, which were allowed by state law. But as a district, they made that decision. They were going to get rid of those practices. They reduced and eliminated these practices and really improved their outcomes.
Yeah.
I've worked with lawmakers across the country supporting changes in state law. We've had some successes. We've had some challenges. In my home state of Maryland, we were successful a couple of years ago in getting a law passed to prohibit the use of seclusion in our public schools. So no longer could you put a child in a room against their will and not let them out. I mean, that should be law everywhere as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But we've worked with lawmakers really across the country, whether it be, Washington State or Connecticut or Texas or Illinois. We've worked to support changes in laws. I've testified at congressional committees on this as well. And again, where we can get better laws and policies, I actually happen to believe there should be federal law around restraint and seclusion in schools. There is no federal law, and as a result, your rights change as you go from state to state. It's a civil rights issue. It's a human rights issue.
Yep.
It's a disability rights issue.
Yep.
Those rights should not vary from state to state. So laws and policies are part of what we do. I would say probably what I'm most passionate about and I think is the most important is the education piece of this, because it's not enough simply to say, don't do these things, are wrong. Don't do these things, are harmful.
Yes.
If we don't bring to people what are the better things we can and should do,
That's right.
how do we better support kids and teachers and staff and families and move away from things like restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, and corporal punishment? I believe there's a lot of things that we can be doing to help people move away from those practices, but it takes a shift.
Yes.
So we do a lot in the name of education, and that looks like podcasts. We've been doing podcasts for a number of years now where we interview experts, we interview families and caregivers, we interview self-advocates. We talk about the alternatives, the better things we can do. I do a lot of presentations at conferences and events, kind of all around the country and even throughout North America, highlighting better approaches to supporting kids, ways of moving away from behavioral approaches that not only aren't working but are often leading to some of the challenges that we see. I speak to graduate, undergraduate courses. We have an online learning portal. We do book studies. So we do a lot of work in really trying to shift ideas, perspectives, and approaches to
Yes.
supporting kids
Yes.
who are often misunderstood in the name of behavior. And that's what's at the root of this. This work that we do is really about kids, often kids with disabilities, often neurodivergent
Yes.
kids, often kids with a trauma history. But these are kids that are often misunderstood due to behavior that they might be exhibiting in a school. And that misunderstanding leads to a lot of approaches that are not working.
That's
and
right.
unfortunately, in schools and systems, when approaches aren't working, we sometimes don't change direction. We do more of those things that aren't working. And we see that time and time again.
Right.
So, in my mind, education is probably the most important aspect of what we focus
Yes.
on. The other thing that we do a lot of individual support. In fact, just prior to talking to you, I was talking to a mother who was going through a situation involving restraint, seclusion, changing a placement, all of these things. And this is something that we commonly, get. We get emails, phone calls, social media messages from families, from caregivers, from educators, from a lot of people who might be in a situation where someone they know, someone they love, someone they care for, is on the other side of some kind of punitive or exclusionary discipline. Maybe it's restraint or seclusion, maybe it's suspension or expulsion,
Yeah.
but something that is not working for them. And we try to offer help and support. So if a family reaches out to us and is looking for help, if they're in the middle of a situation, we might offer them help and guidance of the things that they might consider doing. I know we plan to talk more about that kind of in the second part,
Yeah.
but that's a big part of what we do is we try to offer support.
Okay.
Educators, I have educators that reach out. Hey, these things are happening in our schools. How do we bring about changes? What can we
Yes.
do to support changing our practices? So
Yes.
at a high level, that's what the Alliance does.
Okay.
And we do it again through conferences, through events, through where I love the opportunity to go places and talk to people, whether it be a community event or something else. It's really about shifting hearts and minds and really policies and practices and approaches to better support kids.
Okay. Yeah, your plate is full. You and your one other person. Great. I think this is a great place to pause our conversation so that we can come back and talk about those specifics. But in the meantime, there'll be a few weeks before people get to hear from you again. And so I want them to be able to start to check out your resources. Where is the best place for them to go to start to learn? And then I'll include whatever you tell us about in the show notes as well.
Well, that sounds fantastic. So, if what I'm talking about is of interest to you, I would encourage you to check out our website, first of all. That is seclusion.org. We have a lot of resources there, a lot of articles there, and it connects to a lot of our other channels. We are on most social media channels. There's always new social media, of course, coming out. Probably our largest community is on Facebook still, because we have a lot of parents, a lot of educators, a lot of people that are on Facebook. So you can find us on YouTube. We have a really amazing series of podcasts and things that we've done on YouTube. So definitely, look for those. I encourage people to reach out. You can reach out to me directly. My email is Guy, Guy at endseclusion.org. If you're in a situation and you're looking for help or support, feel free to reach out. We've got a phone number as well that I can provide to you. But, whether you're an educator, whether you're a parent or caregiver, whoever you may be, if you're going through something related to this and we can help, I would encourage you to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right.
Absolutely.
I hope
Pleasure to be here
people
today.
come back for our part 2, and I look forward to talking to you then.